I love accents, and
Yes.
we're about to have a character in our series. This guy named Richard Trevithick, who's probably my favorite character we've studied in all of Backtest, and he's from Cornwall.
Right.
And so, guess who the best movie character is if you want to go hear sort of the Southwest England accent and try to get it down.
I have no idea. What is it?
It's Hagrid from Harry Potter. So I've just been watching.
Really?
That's right. Been watching Harry Potter, listening to Hagrid, and trying. Harry, Harry.
That's funny because
Yeah, we got it down.
Trevithick is also a huge dude.
That's right. Yeah, he's a lot like Hagrid. Yeah,
Nice.
good
That's
point.
how I'm going to picture him now. You ready to go?
Let's do it.
Welcome to the 7th episode of Season 2 of Backtest, the podcast about defining moments in market history and their timeless lessons. I'm Daniel Gamboa,
And I'm Matt Harris.
and we are your hosts.
Before we dive in, a quick reminder that this show is for informational purposes only, and it is not investment advice. Daniel and I may have investments in the companies discussed.
The reason why George Stephenson is remembered while the names of engineers of equal or greater ability are forgotten is a simple one. He is popularly regarded as the author of the railway and the steam locomotive. No other invention had such an overwhelming effect upon society as this first form of mechanical transport, nor has anything usurped its place in the affections of subsequent generations. From the outset, the spectacle of a railway train in full cry excited wonder and admiration, not unmixed with awe. Contemporaries of George Stephenson grew to manhood in a world which had never known any attractive power other than horses. Yet they lived to see express trains traveling at mile-a-minute speeds. We have since conquered the road and the air with newer forms of power and can travel faster than sound, but no subsequent development has equaled in significance or in impact upon the imagination this first mighty stride, which took man from a secure and settled environment, hallowed by centuries, into a new, exciting, yet disturbing world, which at once opened up limitless possibilities. That is from a book published in 1960 called George and Robert Stephenson, The Railway Revolution by L.T.C. Rolt. And in my mind, if you swap out a couple of words in that paragraph, you could easily say the same thing about artificial intelligence or maybe the world that we're heading into as a result of AI, which, part of why we decided to study the railway revolution market period, other than the parallels and the sheer size of capital investment, which will come up in the next episode, is that railways are arguably the most comparable period to what we're living through with AI right now, in my mind.
Yeah. This is going to be a really fun series. And, I would go as far as saying that, even the telecom period of the 90s and 2000s doesn't really hold a candle to both railways and AI. These are the two periods to compare when it comes to capital spending.
Yeah.
This series is the story of how railways changed the world. And it's going to look a little bit like our Shale Revolution series. In episode 1 of our railway series, we're going to start with the wild story of how rail technology broke through, followed by the story of how rail changed markets and really changed how the world operated in the next couple episodes.
Yeah. And by the way, just to put the immensity of this whole thing into perspective, what railways and the technological breakthrough at their core, the steam engine did, for over 5,000 years, horses were the primary mode of transportation and even the primary mode of productive power besides water wheels and windmills. And then in the late 1700s, early 1800s, these steam engines and these rail locomotives come into the picture and they change everything and they accelerate development so much that less than 100 years later, we have airplanes and cars. And then 60 years after that, in the blink of an eye, we have rockets and we can put humans into space.
Speaking of technology and energy, this is a perfect time to thank EQT Corporation for helping us bring you the stories of market history.
Yes, it is. At Backtest, we study market cycles because patterns from history rhyme. We are about to dive into how huge technological breakthroughs and new energy reserves were a core part of the Industrial Revolution and the development of railways, which is the exact same pattern we're living through today with artificial intelligence.
That's right. And the company unlocking energy resources to power AI is EQT, producing American natural gas to help deliver affordable, reliable energy at scale. All right, so let's set the stage. In order to understand the story of railways, we have to zoom out and go back to England in the year 1700 to learn about the invention of the steam engine.
So, Matt, paint a picture for us. Like, what was it like to live back in the 1700s?
Imagine you're a 30-year-old in England in 1700. You and your family, and maybe your 4 or 5 kids, you live in a one-bedroom cottage with a dirt floor about 3 miles from a small market town.
Not that different than now.
Yeah, yeah, exact same, pretty much. And there's a fireplace in the corner of the room that is really important to the family, right? It burns the wood to heat the house, it provides some of the light, and it cooks all your food. So this fireplace is, critical to your life. And the main thing that's keeping you up at night is straight up survival, right? Which is the same thing that's been keeping your family up at night for 10 generations, is just surviving. Is the harvest this year going to provide enough food for everyone? Is there enough wood to warm the house this winter? Are you going to freeze to death? Are your kids going to survive to be adults? You actually, you imagine you already lost one at childbirth, and then you lost another one to tuberculosis,
Yeah.
which is a common occurrence. That's from malnourishment. It was very common in England in the 1700s. But there's some excitement around town about this new farming method that you're hearing about, but you're skeptical, right? Because for hundreds of years, any increases in food production have been quickly outrun by how they cause the population to grow faster. And these kinds of, exciting advances in farm production, they always end up with everybody barely able to survive because the population growth just keeps growing faster than whatever breakthrough that comes from farming. But your friends at the cottage across the field, Jebediah, across the field, uh, they're, they're saying that this new farming method is different, right? It's doubled their wheat output, and they're not worried about food this year, and they're actually not even worried about food next year. So you're excited, but there's one other thing you need to have this breakthrough farming method be one that leads to sustained population growth, sustained economic growth, and it's that you need enough energy. And that was a major problem in the year 1700 in England for two reasons. The first reason was that the major source of energy at the time was actually wood, and there just wasn't any left in England in the 1700s. They'd used it all, they'd cut down all the trees. And in 1700 England, we were actually in the midst of what I would consider to be the last energy transition. We were transitioning from biomass, things like wood, to hydrocarbons, with the first one being coal. So we're going from wood to coal here. And coal is great because it's very energy dense, about twice as energy dense as wood. And you don't have to worry about it getting wet, but it has one major challenge, and it's that you have to dig for it. And by the 1700s, England had used all the coal that was easy to get to, and now they're having to dig down below the water table to get to the coal it needs to sustain its economy and its population growth. And so the problem was at this point that the coal mines are flooding because they're below the water table and they have no way to drain the water. And to say this is a problem in 1700 in England, that really is not a big enough word for what's going on here. Accessing all the coal below the water table was the only way for all or even most of your kids to survive to being adults. And England and your family in particular needs this energy breakthrough to survive.
That's funny, Matt. This guy that you were describing must have been an economist because he's somehow really well versed in like population growth and economic breakthroughs and food supply. I love it.
He's very advanced.
I felt like I was there. In another example of history rhymes, I was really struck by how this is the mirror image of the shale revolution, like you said earlier. Remember that shale unlocked energy, natural gas first, at a time when we in the US thought we were running out, and it did it by figuring out the best way to pump water into rocks, right? And so in this case, the problem to solve is actually how to pump water out of the rocks, out of the mines, to satisfy this growing need for energy. And the invention that solves this problem, and really the core technological breakthrough that leads to the Industrial Revolution, among other factors, is the steam engine. So how the steam engine comes about is probably one of the most fascinating stories in all of history. So we got to be careful here for two reasons. One, as a mechanical engineer, I could nerd out on this for hours, and I did spend actually quite a bit of inordinate amount of time on YouTube watching steam engines visualizations. And I sent you a couple of those.
Yep.
But two, as with any technology, there are a ton of breakthroughs upon which the steam engine is built. And if you want to dive into this rabbit hole, I highly recommend a book called The Most Powerful Idea in the World, A Story of Steam, Industry, and Invention by William Rosen. And we'll put that in the show notes. To kind of keep this as concise as possible, the core principle to understand, to set up the story we're about to tell, is that water expands when it turns into steam. Okay, water expands when it turns into steam. And the same amount of water takes up roughly 1,700 times more volume when it evaporates into steam. So if you boil water, You turn it into steam to fill, I'm picturing a big barrel, and then condense that steam back into water. It leaves behind a vacuum, empty space. And if that's too abstract for you, a decent analogy is how water wants to flow to the lowest spot in a basin, right? So if you think about you're at the beach, you dig a hole in the sand, you fill it with water, and then you kind of dig a trench on the side. That water is going to want to fill that void. It will flow into it. So from a physics perspective, this is completely different. But in terms of how you might picture it, that's basically what's going on here. And it took about a century worth of scientific experiments to learn how this works. And in 1698, a guy named Thomas Savery patents a way to use this vacuum principle to create a water pump. And he calls this the fire engine. And it's a pretty crude, inefficient pump. It basically injects steam into a cylinder, it condenses it to create a vacuum, and that opens a valve to the water in the mine. So the vacuum sucks the water out, and then the valve closes, and then an exit valve gets opened, and steam gets injected back into the cylinder to force the water out of the exit valve. Pretty crude solution, very inefficient, does not scale. But the guy who then first makes this work commercially is a guy by the name of Thomas Newcomen. And he had worked with Savery before. He spends about a decade tinkering with the fire engine. And in 1712, he builds an atmospheric engine and sets one up at a coal mine in Staffordshire. And you can kind of picture a giant rocking beam the size of a small house, basically kind of a seesaw with a piston and a cylinder on one side and a pump rod going down into the mine on the other side. And on the piston side, you have steam that can fill the cylinder. Then cold water gets sprayed in, the steam condenses, that vacuum forms. The atmospheric pressure pushes the piston down because the force of the air outside is greater than the force of the vacuum inside. And that makes the beam tilt away from the water, brings up the pump rod, and the water gets pulled out of the mine. And all of a sudden you have a working pump. This is actually a huge deal. These Newcomen engines start to spread across Britain. They let miners dig deeper than ever before. And more importantly, to the point you were making earlier, Matt, it grows the coal supply to keep up with demand. And this is what I think of as the original steam engine and the parallel to the Mitchell energy fracking breakthrough, right? It's a big deal, but even though it's starting to spread, it doesn't really fully scale to the entire country, to the whole economy. The big constraint for the Newcomen engine is that it needs a ton of coal to fuel the boiler that creates the steam. And that's because every time that you condense the steam in the cylinder actually cools down, and then you need to heat it back up for the next cycle. And that's a lot of wasted energy. So this Newcomen engine consumes a lot of coal. That's expensive. It means that you can only really use it to pump water out of coal mines because you were sitting right next to lots of coal that you could just put into the furnace. If you could somehow figure out a way to make this more efficient, it might be useful for other applications too that also require movement. And this is where everybody's favorite mechanical engineer, because I know you have one, Matt, enters the picture, a guy by the name of James Watt. This guy is revered in history for good reason. Everybody who's studied engineering will have come across him. So James Watt is Scottish. He was trained as an instrument maker. And around 1765, he gets asked to repair a Newcomen engine. He's looking at it and he's tinkering with it. And he has this flash of insight that supercharges the Industrial Revolution. He realizes you're wasting all this energy heating and cooling the cylinder over and over. What if you could keep the cylinder hot all the time? Right? Like, what if you let the steam condense in a separate vessel connected by a pipe? You can let the steam rush from the hot cylinder into a container, maybe condense it there. The vacuum still forms, the piston's still going to move down, and then the pump rod's still going to move up on the other side of the beam, and the cylinder itself never gets cooled. And this condenser chamber that Watt comes up with changes everything. And the Watt engine uses 75% less fuel than a Newcomen engine for the same amount of power. 3/4 of the coal that you were burning before was just reheating the cylinder. So imagine making your car 4 times more fuel efficient, right? Like imagine going from 30 miles a gallon to 120 miles a gallon. That's huge, right? Like at that point, who cares about gas prices? You're filling up like once a month. Doesn't matter. James Watt, of course, patents this in 1769. He's going to go to defend this patent actually over the course of the next couple of decades very aggressively. But his engine doesn't get commercialized until the mid-1770s. And it's all because even though the mechanics of the engine are brilliant and they've solved the problem, the materials of the time, right, the iron and the process to machine these parts are not quite there yet. And in fact, this is going to be a recurring theme here because at almost every point in the story, step change improvements in iron and in manufacturing processes are unlocking more ambitious, better performing engines. James Watt, actually, to address some of these shortcomings, ends up partnering with a Birmingham manufacturer. His name is Matthew Boulton, who contributes his workshops at his Soho manufactory and contributes capital into the project. And they come up with a brilliant business model, which, I don't know, it feels very modern, Matt. I was actually surprised to see this. Basically, they charge their customers royalties on the fuel savings versus a Newcomen engine.
The way these guys defended their patent and built their model around their patent is actually a great case study. They also made it so that you had to pay them to come set it up.
Yeah.
So you couldn't even set this thing up without paying back to the Soho manufactory.
Yeah, it's an integration fee. By the 1780s, these are being used to pump water out of coal mines, but they're also used to drive shafts in textile mills and flour mills. They're used to do all kinds of useful work that could only be done by hand or with animals before. And by 1800, there are roughly 500 Watt engines across Britain, and the Industrial Revolution is in full swing with one caveat. These engines are enormous. They're still the size of buildings. If we were talking about computers, we're still in the ENIAC era, right? Like low power computers the size of big rooms. You can't use these giant steam engines for locomotives, no chance. You can't run railways with them. And there's one guy, a genius that we talked about at the top, our favorite character, maybe the most colorful character that we've ever covered, that changes all of this, right? Who is that guy, Matt?
Yeah. So I love this guy. I said I think he's my favorite character that we've studied in Backtest, and his name is Richard Trevithick. He's from Cornwall, which is the far southwest corner of England, and I turned his story into a one-page fairy tale because I couldn't resist. So you ready for this?
I'm ready. Well, actually, I don't know if I'm ready, but let's go.
Once upon a time, there was a Cornish giant named Richard Trevithick. He grew up in the copper mines of Cornwall, and by the age of 15, he had earned the respect of all men twice over, once as an engineering prodigy, and again for his physical prowess. Legends abound about how young Trevithick moved 500-pound engineering tools with his bare hands where others needed a crane and wagons. Like every Cornish engineer in the year 1790, Richard Trevithick's enemy was the James Watt patent. They hated paying royalties to outsiders. It felt absurd to them that London and Birmingham financiers should profit from Cornwall's copper. Trevithick became famous for defying the Watt patents, especially at the mines of Ding Dong. Real name. Watt's agents tried to serve Trevithick, noticed that he was breaching their patents at the Ding Dong mines, only to be seized by angry miners and Trevithick loyalists. "You can tell Mr. Watt," one supposedly shouted in a thick Cornish accent, "that we bain't paying for steam that comes from Cornish coal." The Watt agents were dangled over a mine shaft until they promised never to return. And then Trevithick did something even more dangerous. At a time when steam engines were enormous stationary machines operating at low pressure, Trevithick began experimenting with compact high-pressure steam. It was extraordinarily risky. Boiler explosions terrified people. Building one in 1800 was something like experimenting with a SpaceX rocket in your living room today. But it worked. And in 1802, in the town of Camborne, Trevithick demonstrated a steam-powered carriage moving under its own power. It was in one machine, the first locomotive, the first traction engine, the first automobile, and the first portable general-purpose steam engine. Trevithick had solved the problem of mobile power decades before the world was ready for it. But the roads were controlled by turnpike interests and coach operators who hated the idea, so Trevithick turned to rails. At the Penny Darren Iron Works in 1804, his locomotive hauled heavy loads of iron and coal along the rails for the first time in history. And once again, it worked. The problem was the world underneath the locomotive. The rails cracked under the weight. The cheap iron of the early Industrial Revolution was too brittle to support the future Trevithick had invented. Trevithick had defeated Watt. Now he ran into an even more formidable enemy, the material constraints of the age itself. So he left. In 1816, Trevithick sailed to Peru, lured by the promise of silver mines high in the Andes. His compact engines could be broken apart, loaded onto donkeys, and carried into the mountains and used to drain flooded silver mines. To British engineers, South America looked like El Dorado. While there, Trevithick lived through revolutions, civil wars, financial ruin, and repeated near-death experiences during the Wars of Independence associated with Simon Bolivar, even joining Bolivar's army for a short time. When he finally returned to England in 1827, he was completely broke. And this is the great irony of the Cornish giant. The man who invented the high-pressure steam engine, the technology that made railways possible, never made a dime from his breakthrough. Today, Trevithick lies in an unmarked grave near London, but his image appears among Britain's great inventors in one of Westminster Abbey's window panes. And in Camborne, Cornwall, they still celebrate Trevithick Day every year, honoring the giant who built the future too early. The end.
That's incredible, dude. I love this story. Yeah, and you called it a fairy tale, but this is all true. It's incredible what this guy lived through. He's like the Stuart Brand of the 1800s. He was in all the key places. Most people probably wouldn't have picked this up, but Simon Bolivar is the George Washington of South America. Right. He fought next to the George Washington of South America after building the first locomotive. He's the Forrest Gump. he's in every scene in the 1800s.
That's right. I've come to believe this guy needs a brand built around him. Like, let's take out Supreme and replace it with Trevithick. It sounds like terrific. Like I'm like Gretchen Wieners on Mean Girls, right? Like she tried to make fetch work. I'm gonna make Trevithick work. It's gonna mean somebody that's really smart, huge, and crazy.
I love it.
Trevithick.
We could spend the whole episode here. All right, what's next? Let's talk about the rail problem that Trevithick had, because in my mind, if that gets solved, among other things, it could have completely changed history, and Trevithick might actually be a much better known person.
At this point in the story, we're in the year 1805. Like you said, the only thing stopping a functioning prototype of a single railway is actually the rails under the train. The iron is not strong enough to support the train running on top. This all starts to change as we move into the 1800s. By 1820, the strongest kind of iron, which is called wrought iron, the price is down about 50%. The quality of the iron being made is way higher. And the strongest kinds of iron could now be mass produced. And this is for the first time in history between 1800 and 1820. This is when we start to see the railway proposals to move coal to market that are just jumping off the page in terms of economics. What I saw was that they're about 1/8 the cost of the existing technology, which is using horses to get coal to the nearest canal. There's a really, really great book called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital by Carlota Perez.
Yep.
She has a name for this moment. She calls it the Big Bang. It's when a new technological revolution suddenly becomes economically and socially unavoidable. And I think that's where we are in the story now, because you're starting to get these railway proposals that are just, they're no-brainers economically now that the iron's there.
Yeah. You have the steam engine is in place, and it's not just a giant building, but now you've, through Trevithick's developments, made it small enough that you could put it on rails. The iron is getting malleable and reliable enough and cheap enough so that you can build strong enough rails to support these locomotives. The key breakthroughs are there. And what you really need at this point is somebody who can put it all together into a working commercial system. So let's bring back George Stephenson, who we teased when we opened the episode, which, by the way, he's still mainstream famous in the UK. So if you're somewhere else, if you're somewhere outside of the UK right now and have never heard of him, you should know George is the equivalent of someone like a Thomas Edison or a Henry Ford. Very well-known historical figure. And the quick background on George, he's born in 1781 in a coal mine village called Wylam, just outside of Newcastle. His dad is a fireman, which is the guy that shoves coal into a Newcomen engine to keep it running. And the family's poor, dirt floor, one-room house. George doesn't go to school. He's illiterate until he's 18 years old. And at that time, he's working as a colliery engine man, and he starts paying out of his own wages for night classes to learn to read and write and do basic math. This guy's not from the world of gentleman engineers, right? Like, he didn't go to Edinburgh. He didn't go to Cambridge. He has no patrons at first. Everything he learns about steam engines, he learns by taking them apart, by putting them back together, by seeing what works, and by tinkering. By 1808, he's working on engines at Killingworth Colliery, which was a coal mine in northeast England, belonging to a group of families called the Grand Alliance. And George ends up dramatically improving a Newcomen engine for Killingworth and gets promoted in 1812 to head engineer for all the machinery at all the Grand Allies' collieries. This position ends up allowing him the time and the resources to start tinkering with something a little bit more ambitious, which in 1814, he builds his first locomotive. And he calls it Blücher, I think is how you pronounce that. There's a Prussian general that beats Napoleon that he named this after.
Blücher. Blücher.
Yeah.
French.
We need the Austrian accent to actually pronounce that properly, I feel like. This Blücher locomotive that he builds works, but barely. It's kind of similar to Trevithick's engine from 10 years before this. It can haul coal on rails. But George notices that if you direct the exhaust steam up the chimney of the locomotive instead of just venting it out, it actually draws more air harder through the boiler, basically turbocharging this locomotive. And so it makes it go faster. It makes it more responsive. It's hotter inside of the boiler. You can make more steam, right? And the engine generates more power. He calls it steam blast. Trevithick had actually tried something similar in the Puffing Devil, but George makes it work. And it ends up doubling the efficiency of the boiler in the locomotive, which has a similar effect to the Watt engine because this now starts to make more economic sense relative to other modes of transportation. So now you've got a working engine. And like you talked about, by 1820, wrought iron comes in. It's more malleable. It's stronger. You can now start to design rails that work without shattering under these heavy locomotives. And by the early 1820s, for the first time in history, you have a working locomotive and a track that can hold it. Except you still have a solution in search of a problem. Because the third variable that they needed to get this off the ground is that transportation's a major constraint, but it's by no means a foregone conclusion that a railway is the solution that can unlock the speed and the efficiency at scale that these transportation constraints need. So George needs a customer, right? Like a champion that will help him get the resources and give him the shot to prove this out. And in 1821, he gets a shot. It's a group of Quaker businessmen in Darlington led by a guy named Edward Pease, who are planning a coal hauling line in Northeast England.
This is a really big moment for George Stephenson because the Stockton and Darlington line was actually it was surveyed to be a horse tramway, the old technology. And George Stephenson goes to Edward Pease and essentially makes like a VC style pitch.
And Matt, a horse tramway is basically a set of carts on rail, but the engine, so to speak, is the mode of power is a horse that pulls it along, right?
Right. And so George Stephenson goes to Edward Pease and he makes his pitch that this should be a steam locomotion railway. And at this point in history, there is zero evidence that what George Stephenson is pitching is more economic, more reliable, or anything like that than a horse tramway.
This must have felt like a self-driving car pitch, right?
Yeah, like he makes his pitch, and this is a Quaker in 1821, right? So this is not someone that's like just taking risks left and right. He's
not an early adopter.
Yeah, Quakers not early adopters. That's what I've heard. This is not like a hey, give me $100,000 to try my thing. This on equivalent dollars. This is at least a $50 million project. This pitch that George Stephenson makes to Edward Pease to pivot this project to be a steam railway is like, to me, it's like one of the best examples of like a great man theory, right? Like someone that can not only get in there and get in front of them and communicate the engineering and sell and project a vision and actually get this deal closed and shift the Stockton and Darlington Railroad to this new technology. This is a huge moment in the story.
Yeah, so they hire Stephenson as the engineer. He surveys the line. He builds the locomotive. And on September 27th, 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opens for business. All these engines have names. It's called the Locomotion Number 1. Very unimaginative name.
Creative, yeah.
Yeah, Puffin' Devil, much better. Catch Me Who Can. Come on. He'll get better. We'll see. But anyway, so there's Locomotion Number 1, built by the Robert Stephenson Company firm, which is a company that George founded with his son Robert, named after his son. It hauls coal wagons, and it has an open carriage full of passengers down the line. But primarily, this is really for industrial use. This is for coal hauling. This is really not a passenger intercity railway, but it is the first public steam railway in the world. And overnight, George Stephenson goes from being a self-taught colliery engineer in Northumberland near Newcastle to a well-known name in British big project circles. The Stockton and Darlington opens in September 1825, but the more interesting development is actually 200 miles to the southwest in Liverpool.
Yes, but before we go to Liverpool, which is really a story about infrastructure and what it takes to build it, Everyone is talking about affordability these days, especially energy prices and how the AI build-out might impact them. When you look at the data, it actually all comes back to infrastructure.
Yeah, energy markets are all about supply and demand. Demand for energy is rising, and it doesn't just turn off because we don't have enough energy. We need enough energy supply to meet the demand. Otherwise, prices spike to try to balance the market. And to produce that energy and to turn it into power, into electricity, we need great infrastructure.
That's right. That's why EQT is helping educate consumers and policymakers on what drives affordability in electricity markets across the US. The data is striking. Since 2020, states like Massachusetts, California, Connecticut, and Maine have seen electricity prices rise roughly 3 times faster than the rest of the country. This is fundamentally an infrastructure problem. The natural gas to generate power is available. We have the supply. The issue is that regional pipeline projects have been canceled or blocked. Permitting takes years, and that means energy supplies can't go to where demand is growing.
Yeah, this is a problem with a very straightforward solution. As a country and as states and as local communities, we need to be able to build. To learn more and explore the data yourself, go to eqt.com/energy-affordability. Big thanks to EQT for helping us bring you the stories of market history and how they apply today. All right, so back to Liverpool. Liverpool in the early 1820s is the second busiest port in Britain. Raw cotton comes in from America, manufactured cotton goes out, and almost all of it has to move about 33 miles inland to Manchester, where the textile mills are. The problem is the only way to move freight is by canal, and there are basically two canals. There's the Bridgewater, and there's the Mersey and Irwell, and they've essentially formed a duopoly, and they're charging whatever they want, right? Like it's a toll booth for them. And in some cases, these tolls are actually higher than the cost of shipping the same goods across the Atlantic, which is crazy to think about. Just to move 33 miles, you're paying more than to move across the ocean. And they're getting squeezed, and they're pretty frustrated. They're furious about this. The guy who decides to do something about it is a corn merchant named Joseph Sandars. In 1822, he gets a group of these fed-up Liverpool businessmen together. They form this provisional committee. It takes a few £1,000s. The goal is to build an alternative, to try to figure out an alternative to these canals. And so they need a surveyor. And the first guy that they hire is a man named William James, who's actually a fascinating character unto himself. We're not going to spend a lot of time on him. He's a bit of a tragic character in all of this. He's a true railway evangelist. He's not an engineer. He's a surveyor, but he's been talking about this Liverpool to Manchester railway for years at this point. He's also very overextended. He's really bad with money. And within a couple of years, he ends up in debtor's prison. So that doesn't work. It's funny because we're about to tell a story of the guy that replaces him. This guy, William James, could have been a legend, and nobody remembers him.
No way. And the thing William James brought was that he had the vision for the national network. But to me, one of the things that this story draws out is the leader of these tech revolutions has to be the complete package, right? So William James is more of a promoter. George Stephenson sees the national network. He understands the engineering. He knows how to pitch. He has a lot of experience building the railways. That's who we need at the helm.
Yeah, maybe. Jobs had Steve Wozniak. This guy could have been the Steve Jobs. And most people talk about Steve Jobs and talk less about Steve Wozniak. But nevertheless, by mid-1824, the committee turns to the only engineer in Britain who's actually built a public steam railway, and that's George Stephenson. They hire him. He surveys the route. And now the thing about George, as you said, he's a brilliant engineer. He is not a meticulous surveyor, and he's got a lot on his plate. He's a bit overextended with work at this point. He's still finishing the Stockton and Darlington, and he's running his locomotive works in Newcastle. So he delegates a lot of the detailed survey work to his assistants, which, by the way, at this point, his son, who's his right-hand man and a brilliant engineer in his own right, would have probably done a lot of this work, except he's in South America at the time. So he's not around. And that comes back to bite George in a bit.
He's in South America meeting Richard Trevithick on a beach.
That's right.
Total random, nothing else to say there, but that's it.
Yes, indeed.
It happened.
In fact, Trevithick only comes back to the UK because Robert Stephenson pays for his trip because he's dirt poor. Yeah, incredible. The story is just nuts. So anyway, these other assistants, they're the ones taking the levels, they're measuring gradients, they're drafting maps, all the work that you need to do in order to submit this to Parliament to try to get it approved. The numbers come back. George kind of just signs off on it. He doesn't review the whole thing. And the bill moves forward under George Stephenson's name. And those details, the survey, the things that George Stephenson didn't quite check, the canal lobby ultimately is going to use those to beat George up pretty bad in Parliament publicly. But before we go there, to understand how that works, we probably need to spend a little bit of time of understanding the mechanics of these parliamentary applications and how incorporation worked back in the 1800s. And Matt, you spent a decent amount of time researching some of this.
The Liverpool line, and this isn't just some regular company that's forming. This is a major political project, and it actually needs a new law to be passed in order to move into construction. And this new law that needs to be passed, it's what would give the Liverpool line the right to acquire the land it needs to build and operate the railway. Eminent domain didn't exist then, but kind of an early form of that concept. And the new law would be what provides the legal protections that makes outside investment possible, or the limited liability in today's verbiage. So said differently, right? Like the Liverpool line it's dead in the water if Parliament doesn't pass a whole new law allowing it to be built.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without this approval, they have no guaranteed path to securing the land. They're not operating in a clear legal framework, and investors can face substantial personal liability.
This is like a permit on steroids, right? Basically.
Right. And it's important to remember, right, that like the Liverpool line and all these railways, these are very high capex projects. And no one's going to invest if there's no guaranteed way to get the land, even just the land they need, much less to construct on under budget. And they're definitely not going to invest if they can be financially liable, way beyond their original investment commitment. So before the Liverpool line can even approach Parliament, it first has to prove that it's not a fantasy land project. And so the promoters are required to conduct engineering surveys. They're required to publish public notices in designated newspapers with traffic and profit projections, essentially a business plan. They're required to prepare expert and business testimony. And they have to prove that 10% of the project's required capital has been subscribed to and is actually deposited at one of the approved banks. So parliamentary sessions run roughly from February through June each year. And by the 1824 session, the Liverpool line is finally ready to seek its new law. George Stephenson's in place as the lead engineer. The surveys are completed. The proposals have been properly advertised in the required newspapers. And 10% of the capital has already been raised, actually entirely from sophisticated Liverpool and Manchester businessmen. And it's been deposited at a approved bank. So there's all these steps just to apply to Parliament. The company submits its proposal at the end of the 1824 parliamentary session. And what this kicks off is like some weird hybrid of an intense court case, a lobbying campaign, an engineering review, and a political battle, really all in one that has to happen for this to get its law approved and move forward to construction.
Yeah, and I feel like George Stephenson ends up bringing a knife to a gunfight. So, think about who's lining up on the other side of this. You have the Bridgewater trustees and the Mersey and Irwell canals, the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. These are some of the wealthiest commercial interests in Britain at the time, and they've been making enormous profits off this monopoly for decades. George is the ultimate underdog in all of this. And for these guys, the canal guys, the railway line is an existential threat to their business. And so they do what any well-capitalized incumbent does still today, right? Like when something threatens their model, they're going to go fight it. They're going to go hire the best possible lawyer they can find. They're going to pay them lots of money, and they're going to go really hard at their opponent to try to make sure that the threat gets mitigated or removed. And the guy that they put in front of George is a barrister, a lawyer named Edward Hall Anderson. And Alderson is a Cambridge man, top of his year, future high court judge. Basically, he's one of the, if not the best, cross-examiners in all of England. And the canal lobby strategy is pretty straightforward. They don't have to win on the merits of the case, on the economics of canals versus railways. They don't have to argue that steam locomotion doesn't really work. All they have to do is have to break George, right? They have to break the engineer of the project, which will kill the project's credibility. And George's name is on every survey document submitted to Parliament. So if you discredit him, you discredit the whole project. So George takes the stand. And remember where he's coming from, right? We talked about it at the top. He's 44 years old at this point. He's self-educated. He didn't learn to read until he was 18. He speaks with a thick Northumbrian accent, which is almost like this. It's a different form of a Scottish accent. And so he's presenting in front of the London establishment. They can barely understand him. And so George is standing in front of a parliamentary committee. He's being questioned by one of the sharpest legal minds in all of Britain. And Alderson starts questioning him on the levels in the survey, the gradients. The levels are wrong, right? The gradients are wrong. The bridge, actually, one of the bridges that goes over the Irwell River is also wrong. Alderson presents these calculations that apparently George's bridge might be below the high water line of the river, which is like catastrophic failure for an engineering project.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
A tough one.
Yeah. Oh, brutal, right? And the most brutal part of all, actually, is that a lot of these numbers are completely wrong. They're not just a little bit wrong. They're completely wrong. And because George hadn't actually checked them, he didn't know. And so he can't defend the math. He doesn't know the math that's behind all this stuff. He didn't do it. His assistants didn't. He didn't check it. So he stumbles in the process of this hearing. He contradicts himself. He gets the answers wrong on some of these basic engineering questions that he's being asked because he's not prepared for it. And Alderson really goes to town. He presses really hard. He reframes George in front of the committee and in front of the press as kind of a self-promoting, half literate amateur who kind of conned his way into the most ambitious infrastructure project going on at the time. And it ends up being, by every account, one of the most brutal cross-examinations in the history of engineering. And George gets publicly dismantled in the process, right? Like, he goes back to his room every night. He's probably thinking that he will have no reputation left after this is all over. And everything he's built since he was that illiterate kid in Wylam is probably gone. And so the bill for the Liverpool to Manchester line obviously fails in committee in June 1825. The canal lobby wins. The Liverpool committee, Joseph Sanders in particular, that merchant that, kind of put their name on the project and all their capital to work, these directors, they're all pretty humiliated too. And George's name gets dragged through the mud. The newspapers frame him as an amateur, maybe a fraud. He's not a serious engineer, should have never been on this project kind of thing. And he goes back to Newcastle and he feels like he just failed in the worst possible way in front of Parliament, in front of the Liverpool committee. And as far as anyone is concerned at this point in 1825, that's the end of the story. Right? Like, the railway thesis is probably dead. George Stephenson is gone and he's just going to be a coal mechanic for the rest of his life. This is kind of Trevithick all over again in a way. Like, the technology exists, the person who can build it is right there, but the system, or like the circumstances, crushed him. And in a pretty real way, kind of feels like the game is over for him.
I mean, this was a total disaster. And the Liverpool committee is also humiliated, right? They're frustrated, but they've already put some money down, right? So, and they're still looking for their alternative to the canals. And so they decide to regroup and make another run at Parliament. But this time they go to two guys, George and John Rennie, to replace George Stephenson as the lead engineers for the project. These two guys have a lot more experience navigating Parliament and the political establishment. When they take over, they play politics. They negotiate with canal owners. They propose a bill that it's just more conventional in how it's going to approach things. They make the trade-offs necessary to win in Parliament because they've done it a bunch of times before when they were building canals. This makes all the difference. The revised bill passes easily in May of 1826 with almost no resistance. The act authorizes £510,000 of share capital and an additional $127,500 in borrowing power,
which is huge, right, Matt? Like, that is like tens of millions of dollars, and at that time that was massive.
Right. We'll get into kind of how big these projects are relative to GDP and all that stuff in the next episode. These are huge capex projects. Not really anything to compare them to then, and AI is the only one now, actually. Yeah. But so the act is secured, but now the company actually runs into a new problem. The Rennie brothers have extensive experience with canals and docks and bridges and with Parliament, but they have never built a railway. The directors asked them to hey guys, why don't we bring in some engineers to help you and then have a little bit more hands-on experience building railways? And one of the proposed engineers is George Stephenson, who believe it or not, by this time has actually recovered from his great humiliation by doing one very powerful thing, which is in the interim, after he got humiliated in Parliament for their first attempt, he got the Stockton Darlington Railway not only working, but operating every day.
Yeah, it's also important to say, Matt, that he had a good relationship with the committee. It wasn't that they were humiliated by him. I think most of them understood, or at least appreciated, that the public relations aspect of that hearing were very strategic by the canal lobby. And it's not that George was incompetent. In fact, he's the only guy that has gotten a railway project off the ground at this point.
Right. So, but the Rennies refused to work with Stephenson. I can only imagine the Rennies at this point, right? When Stephenson got humiliated, they view him as an uneducated colliery engineer. He's beneath the standards of elite civil engineers like them. And because of this issue, negotiations between the company and the Rennies actually break down. And by this point, Stephenson has made one of the greatest engineering comebacks of all time, from complete humiliation on a national stage in Parliament to the lead engineer behind the Stockton and Darlington. And so the company actually fires the Rennies, and they welcome Stephenson back with open arms as the lead engineer to move forward with this railway line.
Yeah, huge inflection point.
So thank God for George that the bill is already through Parliament, and he doesn't have to do that again. I can only imagine if they were like, yeah, come back and let's do that again. He'd be like, I don't know about that, guys. And the construction on the Liverpool and Manchester line begins right after the May 1826 approval. And it immediately presents George Stephenson with just a much greater challenge and much bigger problems than anything he's had to face up to this point in his career. It requires 63 bridges and some absolutely massive earthworks projects to, create giant hills and trenches to try to keep the plain as level as possible. And this was all before dealing with this thing called the Chat Moss.
Chat Moss.
4 miles, about 15% of the line. According to local folklore, this was a bottomless swamp and impossible for rail to cross. Most established engineers in England thought there was no way for rails to cross this thing. The way I think about it is laying railways across Chat Moss would be like laying railways across the Everglades.
Giant marsh, right? Can you imagine? Just everything seems like would sink on this thing.
And it is, right? So conquering Chat Moss is a grueling 2-step process. So the first step is you need to drain enough of the swamp to get, to lay the rail. And the second is in that spot where you drain the swamp, you need to create a 5-foot high solid foundation so the train doesn't sink into a supposedly bottomless swamp. So the directors are panicking regularly about this issue. They want to abandon the route multiple times. Yeah, but Stephenson holds the line for 3 years until New Year's Day in 1830 when the track was laid across Chat Moss. This is a full 4.5 years after construction started. So George Stephenson is really persistent.
That's an intense 4.5 years. Yeah. Very intense.
Yeah. This is an enormous industrial project. Just to put it in context, right? This is a prototype for an entirely new transportation system.
Yeah.
It required 3,000 to 4,000 workers. It was running over budget by the time a really key decision has to be made. That question is, how is the Liverpool and Manchester line going to move the trains?
Yeah. So what are the options, Matt?
So they're leaning towards stationary engines at first, right? Because they're more reliable and less risky. So a stationary engine is just what it sounds like. You put a stationary engine at the train station, and that engine actually uses ropes and cables to pull the train along the track. And so that's actually the front runner at the beginning of all this. You could also do horse tramways in different places. Meanwhile, Stephenson, who at the time, of course, is the only supplier of engines that move themselves, called locomotion engines, was advocating for locomotion, just like he had done with George Pease at the Stockton and Darlington. So the directors actually decide to stage a winner-take-all competition to determine which technology would power the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. I love this, right? This is the engineers' equivalent of a high noon duel with all of England watching.
Yeah. This reminds me of the DARPA challenge of the mid-2000s. Remember that, for self-driving cars with like Stanford and Carnegie Mellon trying to get to deserts and stuff. So at this point, October 1829, the date is set. The directors are ready to have this competition. They set this venue, which is a flat stretch of track called Rainhill, just outside of Liverpool. And they put up a 500-pound prize pool for the winner, which in today's money is about 50, 100K. So not a ton of money, but what's really at stakes is, first of all, the goal is to validate that a locomotive can perform reliably. So Stockton and Darlington is blown and going, but that's a much smaller project. This is a major, very public test for the locomotive technology. And if it fails, it might end up setting all this back by starving it of capital because, if this fails, nobody's going to invest in locomotive technology, at least for another decade. The second piece of this is that the team that wins Rainhill will get the contract to supply the locomotives for the entire Liverpool and Manchester line. And so it won't be a single locomotive, it'll be multiple. And then everyone in British engineering, of course, is watching, because whoever wins this is also going to be in the pole position for the next set of railway projects. And if this project is successful, and this is going to be a very visible project, there's going to be more, right? And so it's not a gimme, because the rules for this are brutal, or like the specifications for what needs to happen to win are really hard. So your locomotive has to haul 3 times its own weight. It has to average at least 10 miles per hour. It has to run 20 round trips without breaking down. And certainly by 1829, no locomotive in the world has done anything close to this. And so 5 entrants show up. 2 of them are basically out before anything even starts. One of them is kind of a joke. There's something called a cycloped, which is literally a horse walking on a treadmill. To your point on the stationary engine, it's like that, but the horse is doing the movement, which is just nuts. It's a bit of a sideshow. There's another engine called the Perseverance, which gets damaged in transit towards Rainhill and never even starts the competition. And so the other 3 engines, that's really where the race is. The crowd favorite is an engine called the Novelty, built by Braithwaite and Ericsson. And it's a beautiful engine. It's lighter. It's really fast looking. When it does the demonstration runs before the competition formally starts, it ends up hitting about 28 miles an hour, so almost 3 times the specification. It's faster than anything anybody has ever seen. The people are losing their minds. The London papers just jump to conclusions and basically say the competition's over. You know, the Novelty's got this in the bag. Then there's another one called the Sanspareil, built by this guy, Timothy Hackworth, who's actually a former colleague of George Stephenson. Really good engineer. The Sanspareil is a good engine, very conservatively designed. But then there's George's locomotive, the Rocket. And so anybody who's studied in the UK will know this name immediately because it's extremely famous. George and his son Robert designed it together. They incorporate 3 really major breakthroughs into this engine. The first one is what's called the multi-tubular boiler. So up until this point, inside the boiler, you really just had one big flue running through the boiler to create the steam necessary for the engine. In this engine, the Rocket, you have about 25 smaller fire tubes, which increases the surface area by a lot, where the heat can transfer into the water. And it also means that you can generate steam much faster than with a single tube. The second breakthrough, the steam blast that we talked about before, so that exhaust steam getting directed up the chimney to draft the fire hotter. And then the third breakthrough, you have angled cylinders that are driving the wheels directly instead of going through this rocking beam linkage that everyone had inherited from Newcomen. And so the trial opens on October 6th. There's over 10, 15,000 spectators watching all this take place. There's engineers, there's members of parliament, there are journalists, there are a ton of investors. Every serious investor in Britain is interested in this project. And by most accounts, a lot of the establishment is waiting for George to fail. The whole thing starts, Novelty, that locomotive that looks beautiful, does really well over the first 2 days, but then it starts breaking down. And a boiler joint fails, they repair it, it falls again, it doesn't really work, it has reliability issues. The other competitor to Rocket, the Sanspareil, has a cylinder failure and is just limping along. But Rocket just runs from the get-go. It ends up doing 20 round trips, doesn't break down. It averages 12 miles an hour under a full load, and it hits peak speeds of around 30 miles an hour on the demonstration runs, and it just absolutely dominates. It's a slam dunk in front of a national audience, running the same kind of distance and duration that an actual commercial railway would actually have to do once it opened. And the guy who built it is the exact same George Stephenson who 4 years earlier walked out of a parliamentary committee thinking he was done forever. That's the guy who built this engine with his son Robert, and now he's triumphant. And after Rainhill, every serious engineer in Britain knows what the future looks like. It's a railway. And to me, I recall back to that William Gibson quote of the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed, right? Like the people that are there that are watching and the engineers that are aware that this is happening immediately know where this is all going. But the mainstream doesn't yet because the line hasn't opened. So that commercial test, opening day, is coming down the line 11 months later, when on September 15th, 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester line is finally ready to open. And reading about this, Matt, I felt a little bit like I was reading about the moon landing moment where everybody in the country is paying attention to one event, like you're glued to your TV watching Of course, back then, people were just either there in person or they were just waiting to hear news about it. And that's actually the intention of the directors for this project. They want the publicity. They intentionally set this whole thing up as a spectacle. So there are 8 locomotives that are going to run simultaneously, including Rocket, right? All of them built by George's firm with his son, the Robert and Stephenson Company. And George is actually going to drive one of them called the Northumbrian on the southern track. And he's going to be pulling a special carriage carrying the Duke of Wellington, who's the sitting Prime Minister of Britain. And then the other 7 locomotives are going to run in formation on the northern track, each of them also pulling carriages with special guests, with members of Parliament, some dignitaries, journalists. And this is really kind of a celebration of technological achievement. But to the crowds who have never seen this, right, and to the investors, it's still a bit of a test, right? Like they're not in control. They're watching this. They're not sure if this is going to work. The message the directors are sending by setting this up like this with all this publicity is basically, hey, Rainhill was not a fluke. We can run 8 of these things at once. This is what the future of transportation looks like, and we own it. We should also mention, I think, that at the same time, there's some serious political friction, just as a bit of a sideshow, which is that in September 1830, especially in Manchester, where 11 years earlier, government cavalry had killed some protesters, and it actually got called the Peterloo Massacre. And so the Duke of Wellington is very unpopular in Manchester. And so when he steps on board the Northumbrian to ride into Manchester, a city that doesn't really like him, that's a little bit of an interesting bet, right? Like a bit of a political risk. So either way, the crowd show up, 400 to 700,000 people show up along the 33-mile railway line. And apparently this is one of the largest peacetime gatherings in British history at this point. And after some pomp and circumstance, a cannon fires, the Northumbrian starts rolling, and the crowd goes wild. And it must have been an incredible sight to be there.
Yeah, you got to remember that at this time, people thought that if you went too fast, that you would die.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
right. Like people thought that like if you went over 20 miles an hour, that the way your body interacts with oxygen would fail and you would suffocate and die.
Yeah.
And so
Wild.
like there's this tension as this train starts moving, starts getting going, because the Stockton and Darlington was only like it's kind of a sub 10 mile per hour train. So now we're getting up to speeds where people are sitting there being like, are we about to watch everyone die?
Right.
And so things get pretty crazy about halfway through the trip to Manchester. The trains stop at Parkside rail station with a planned stop to refill with water before they move on to their big reception in Manchester. And the passengers are all told, you guys stay in your seats because we're just stopping here for water, but nobody listens. The atmosphere is euphoric. And people on the trains just start spilling out onto the tracks. They're talking, they're wandering around, they're inspecting the trains. But remember, there's not just one train here. There are multiple trains, and this is an active train station.
Yeah.
I can only imagine the organizers just being like, "Oh my
God,
Lord."
yeah.
So the Duke of Wellington's carriage had stopped in a position where other trains he wanted to watch kind of the procession roll through this station stop. And the Duke decides now is a good time to reconcile with an old political rival and major railway supporter, this guy named William Huskisson. And so the Duke kind of sticks his hand out, and William Huskisson walks over across the active tracks to shake the Duke of Wellington's hand. And then somebody notices that George Stephenson's rocket is coming through the station fast.
Ugh.
And panic erupts, right? Huskisson's trying to get out of the way. He has some mobility issues. He's kind of an older guy. He's trying to climb back in the carriage. He stumbles. He falls directly into the path of the locomotive and gets run over. Nobody even knows what a train accident is yet. 1 second, Britain's political elite are celebrating the future. They're mending their political rivalries. And the next, one of the country's most famous politicians has been hit and is bleeding out on the track, right? This would be like a well-known member of the House of Representatives getting hit by this train, just to give you a sense of who this guy is. So the crowd goes from just euphoric celebration to horror. And the hero of the day, George Stephenson, maybe, he's a little shocked, but he immediately starts taking action. He's getting another train ready for a rescue mission. And they get Huskisson loaded up, and they make a tear to the nearest hospital at speeds approaching 40 miles an hour, which at this time is an unbelievable speed.
Yeah.
There were very few people, maybe nobody, in the world who's gone this fast at this point in history. But nothing could save Huskisson, a man who had been a major supporter of railway and had been the one actually to convince the government to invest in the very train that ran him down. We'll talk more about that in the next episode, but this is one of the very few projects the government invested in, and Huskisson's actually the guy that convinced them to invest. And so now the organizers of the event have a major dilemma on their hands. Should they cancel the rest of the trip? The Duke wants to shut it down, although it could have been because they were almost at Manchester and people didn't like him there.
Right.
As much as he arguably just caused the first railway death. So tough day for the Duke.
Yeah.
But the problem was this massive euphoric crowd had gathered in Manchester, and there was actually concern that if they shut it down, there would be a riot. And so they continue on to Manchester and they come back to Liverpool late at night. All the while, really completely unsure if Huskisson's death would just kill railway technology in it, and this would be the end.
Well, and it turns out that it doesn't kill it, right? Like even in the face of a pretty tragic death of one of the most prominent supporters of the railways at this point on opening day, in front of the entire country, right? No less. There's nothing stopping this train. Little pun there for you.
Nice.
Yeah. So 2 days later, on September 17th, 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester opens for regular commercial service. The trains start running on the published schedule. The big surprise in all of this actually is how much the public shows up, because if you look back at the director's projections, most of what they were expecting here, and in fact, we talked about how the problem that they're trying to solve is to get around the tolls that the canals are charging them. All of their commercial projections are on freight, right? Like carrying coal and carrying textiles and carrying cotton and manufactured goods. What actually happens, though, is that passengers are really eager to ride on these railways and to get from town to town. And so in its first full year of operation, 1831, the Liverpool-Manchester line ends up carrying roughly like 445,000 passengers, and passenger revenue actually ends up exceeding freight from day one. Right? People in Liverpool and Manchester are paying to ride this thing as fast as the company can run trains. By 1831, the railway is paying dividends on the high single digits. So, and for context, British government consols, government debt at the time is about 3 to 4%. So the railway project is doubling and tripling the risk-free rate here. And every investor in Britain is looking at this. And if they weren't in it, most of them feel like they missed out. But they also feel like there's probably going to be plenty of projects to go make a return on. And this is basically a new asset class, right?
Yeah. I mean, the setup here is just primed for a stock market bubble. The technology doesn't just work. You're using it regularly. The returns are proven with those high dividends, which at this time is all in 1830. That's all investors cared about was dividends and yield. And there isn't really anything else to invest in at the time, right? It was really you mentioned the government bonds. That was the main other alternative to invest in. So the only thing missing from a true stock market bubble is a true master promoter and a media engine, just to do a little foreshadowing to episode 2.
Yeah. To me, this is a bit of the Netscape moment for the Industrial Revolution. I feel like the Rainhill Trials, they proved the technology, right? For anybody who's technical enough to understand it, anybody who was paying attention. But then opening day actually makes everybody pay attention. And really the commercial proof from 1831, like the passenger demand that shows up and then the dividend yields that this thing is spitting off, that really lights the fuse of the boom that's about to come. And I think, every skeptic, every cynical lobbyist that had beat up on George in that parliamentary committee in 1825, I think all those questions have been answered. Probably chat moss can be crossed. Locomotives can run reliably. Passengers will want to ride these trains, and a railway can make money. Right. So, and George Stephenson is an exceptional engineer. And so 5 years after that giant public humiliation, he's been proven right. And of course, the demand for him explodes. And through the 1830s, he basically becomes the most sought after railway engineer in all of Britain. And he consults on dozens of lines. He lives out his later years as a wealthy country gentleman. And he has interests in coal mines and lime and a bunch of things on the side. And Robert Stephenson, goes on to become one of the great engineers of the Victorian era in his own right. So, ultimately, to kind of wrap up the George story, the guy who couldn't read until he was 18 and who was humiliated by lobbyists, he and his son end up building the system that defines the Industrial Revolution. And they helped to light the fuse for probably one of the biggest investment manias in all of history. which we're going to cover in episode 2. So Matt, let's do some takeaways and some lessons learned here.
So I didn't really know any of this story before doing research for this episode. And one major takeaway is really just how incredible the actual story is behind all this stuff. I mean, it feels like it's a Marvel comic for engineers, this story.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Atlas Shrugged, right? Like all the good guys are the engineers and they're trying to make technology work, and the bad guys are all the bureaucrats trying to keep them from doing it.
That's a good point. I didn't think of Atlas Shrugged that way. So one of the things that stood out to me right off the bat as we were kind of doing this episode and preparing was just the size of the problems being solved by the steam engine and railways. These were massive problems around things like making sure there was enough energy for everyone to live and sufficient transportation for businesses to operate. So one obvious takeaway is just that the problem being solved by a technology should be easy to explain. Like if we don't, if we don't get the deep coal, everyone's going to die. or you can use this rail thing to get your product to the customer 10 times faster and 10 times cheaper, right? Like that's the kind of problems that these technologies were solving, even in the beginning. But it was also clear that one genius breakthrough by itself isn't enough. There's a really great book called Crossing the Chasm. It's all about getting new products into the market. And they have this concept called the total product, which says that customers don't buy your core technology all by itself. They buy the complete solution. They buy the outcome that they actually want. And Richard Trevithick is a great example of this. He built a great locomotive prototype, but didn't have the rails that could support it. Iron technology hadn't caught up, so he didn't have the total product. And George Stephenson did about 20 years later. And you see this over and over again with major technological revolutions. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak didn't invent microprocessors for keyboards, but they did integrate them and market them. And they marketed a personal computer and they scaled that market. OpenAI is another more recent example of that. They took Google's transformer architecture and integrated it with the idea of scaling laws and productized it.
Yeah.
So one major takeaway, right, is you really need this total product for a technology revolution to succeed.
Yes, 100% aligned with that. My takeaway is kind of the macro version of yours, which is, I think a key theme of this story is, what does it take to spark technological revolutions? And I kind of think of it as 3 ingredients, right? Number 1, you clearly need a set of scientific insights that are ready to be applied, ready to be integrated into a problem, and to be tuned into that technology that you reference. And in this case, you have all the scientific breakthroughs in vacuums and engines and steam, along with breakthroughs in iron and manufacturing that are pretty critical. Number 2, you need a pocket of substantial capital that has a big commercial problem, right? Where this new technology can solve that problem. And here we have the Liverpool merchants for whom the canals are a real pain, right? And then 3, you need a relentless person with the right team that can suffer through the gauntlet that you have to run through in order to get these things commercialized and scaled. And these types of people are the people that David Senra, for example, covers in his great podcast, Founders, right? And so if you look around, you recognize this pattern now. To build on one of your examples, that's the story of OpenAI, right? Like the team that arguably sparked the AI revolution that we're going through now. So you really need technology, you need capital, and you need relentless founders.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I think the free flow of information between all these people, and especially among the founders, is a major part of that flywheel that you're talking about, that they all can and are speaking to each other a lot. And that was definitely happening in Industrial Revolution UK, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. All right, should we leave it there?
All right. Thank you. If you enjoyed this, the best way to help us is to share this with anyone you think might like it and to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And of course, tune in for episode 2 of our series on railways. See you, Daniel.